All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Brevity Technical Webinar Series. This one here is going to be on Australian compliance for seismic restraints. So welcome. My name's Jai Simpkin. I am new business lead at Brevity, and I'm very excited to discuss this topic today. So it's quite topical, I think. So let's jump into it. If it's the first time you've joined a Brevity webinar, this will be new to you, but if not, we're using the same Slido interactive tool. So if you can right now, get out your smartphones and use this QR code to jump into the Slido, which is an interactive slide where we can do polls, and Slido will be used at the end of the presentation for any questions and answering. And you can ask your questions at any point during the presentation, and it will pop up at the end. So hopefully people can join using that QR code. I'll jump to the next. We've got one quick poll here, so that same QR code is there if you're still getting your phone out. Let's see from the audience. Let's see, which city or country are you dialing in from today? You can see there's one person typing. So we've got at least one person from Auckland, from New Zealand. And I was talking to a few people from Australia that were quite interested in this topic, that may not be able to make the presentation, but we will have a recording afterwards. So I was hoping to see at least one Australia pop up here. I'll give it another few moments before we jump into it. Auckland seems like it's one of the key locations. All right, it looks like everyone is joining from Auckland or maybe New Zealand. Well, definitely New Zealand, but mostly Auckland today. So we'll see what type of questions we get from a New Zealand audience. So this presentation is talking about the compliance in Australia, and let's talk about how it compares to New Zealand as well. So in episode 1, we covered compliance pathways of seismic restraints in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we use the terminology of producer statements, or PS1s, as a means for engineering certification. And a recording of that webinar is on our website for those that missed it and may be interested, for that New Zealand audience here today. But what about Australia? So if you mention Australia, if you mention producer statements in Australia, you'll probably get a few funny looks, as compliance pathways over there and the terminologies are quite different to what we do in New Zealand. And we're not surprised by that, are we? There's a clear size and population difference between the two countries. So New Zealand's about 5 million people, whereas Australia is about 5 times that size and population. And Australia is clearly split into different states and territories, and they each have the same governing body for compliance, but they have their own documents for certification. So yeah, here's a quick snapshot of some of the equivalent PS1s to what the terminologies are in Australian states. So in Australia, seismic it's not new. Earthquakes have been around for a long time, but the seismic design and compliance, the requirement for it is ever changing, like it is in New Zealand. So we often get asked, like, when does seismic load govern the design? And there's no simple answer to that question, because the seismic requirements need to be assessed in all cases against the other loading scenarios, such as wind loading, which is like in Queensland, for example, the wind loading often governs. and that is used to determine which is that governing situation. So there's no simple answer to that one, but typically wind has governed in Australia, but it really only takes one big earthquake to learn, and Australia can definitely learn from what has happened in New Zealand over the past 10 years. So I really do think it's only a matter of time before the Australian, and we have seen recently the Australian regulations has changed, and that's quite good to see, which is highlighted by the activity in the news over the last 6 odd months with earthquakes happening throughout Australia. Let's look at the Australian compliance pathways if we step back for a second. So starting from the top is the Australian Building Codes Board, the ABCB, and that is a body that is responsible for writing and standardising the building requirements. This includes the National Construction Code, the NCC. Among other things, they're responsible for the watermark and code mark certification schemes, and that is a joint endeavour by the various states and territory governments and building industries. So you've got the NCC, which I just mentioned, the National Construction Code. This was previously known as the Building Code of Australia, the BCA, and this is a set of minimum requirements for buildings in Australia. And it is revised every 3 years, and it currently consists of 3 volumes. Volume 1 outlines the requirements for your commercial buildings. Volume 2 focuses on the residential buildings, and Volume 3 is the requirements more for the plumbing and drainage systems. So it's quite clearly split up and defined, which makes it easier. And the NCC categorises all the different types of buildings in Australia into class levels ranging from class 1 to class 10. Looks like I might be having a bit of a lag on my video there, so sorry about that, team. And compliance in Australia can be achieved through various pathways. The most common is through what's called a deemed to satisfy pathway, where building aspects are measured against the NCC requirements. And alternatively, similar to New Zealand, there are alternative solutions to prove compliance through the various testing and calculation methods. So breaking it down further, you've got the various loading standards and material standards, and the NCC specifies what is required, and the standards specify how something is to be designed. And again, it's the job of the engineer to figure out, the load and make sure the capacity of whatever that design is at least greater than the load. And there's a balance between those standards. So that's an overview of the regulatory structure, but what does this mean for seismic interiors? So the NCC Volume 1 for commercial states in there that all of those commercial buildings must be designed to reasonably expected design actions, including earthquake actions. And that references the Australian AS 1170.4 standard. In New Zealand, we've got the equivalent NZ 1170.5. And Section 3 of that Australian earthquake standard applies a hazard design factor over a full Australian map. And this requires earthquake loads to be considered in the design of any building, irrespective of where it is located. That standard requires all non-importance level 1 structures to be designed for earthquake actions, including parts and components, which is typically, your ceilings and internal partitions. Let's talk about what are seismic restraints. So in an earthquake, about 70 to 80% of the total repair costs after an earthquake is due to the damage of non-structural elements. And so this is just to reiterate the importance of seismic restraints for your interiors. The The non-structural failure of those elements accounts for, looking at previous earthquakes, about 60% of all injuries. So that's quite a high number. And the cost of installing seismic restraints is typically less than about 3 to 5% of the total build cost. So there's a clear value proposition there for including seismic restraint designs. So in AS 1170.4, in the parts and components section, there are clear design guidelines for designing various internal elements, such as interior elements, such as your suspended ceilings, your non-load bearing partitions, your various services, and that can also be used for your more industrial racking and shelving, and maybe your floor mounted components. These images here show some of the services, ceilings, and partition examples, and the seismic restraint designs will take into consideration all of the project specific parameters, and then go through to specify details for each of those elements, such as, you know, how your ducting will be fixed to the structure above, what type of fixings to use, what the brace elements are, and etc. And that's essentially the gist of this presentation. So the key takeaways here are: earthquakes do occur in Australia, perhaps just less frequently heard about compared to New Zealand, and less commonly seen, but they definitely do happen. And buildings do need to comply with the National Construction Code in Australia. So seismic restraint designs are required by law for commercial buildings, and that covers all of Australia. And when you split down Australia into the different states and territories, there are different certificates for compliance, such as in Victoria, there's a document called the Reg 126, and in Queensland, there's a Form 15. So they all serve a similar purpose, but engineers need to be aware of that. And I suppose, just as a final plug there, Brevity do have CPENG, professionally qualified engineering, to sign off for seismic restraints covering all Australian states and territories. So I hope there was at least one gem in there for each of you to take away and think, oh, I didn't know that, or maybe that's something I'm going to look into. But let's jump into a bit of Q&A. So you are welcome to use that Slido to log in on your phone, or you can actually do it on the computer as well, to log any questions, and I can do my best to go through them now. So there's one question currently. These should update. So someone has asked, is the Australian Earthquake Standard 1170.4 directly mentioned in the NCC? And does this include parts and components? Hopefully I touched on that. So just repeating that message. Yes, the Australian Earthquake Standard is mentioned in the NCC. So for the commercial buildings, it's mentioned in that volume 1. So that is a means of compliance, that standard. And I believe it mentions that standard just as a whole. So it doesn't specifically mention the parts and components. That's something that our team can check and confirm afterwards. But the fact that it mentions the standard means that parts and components is a means of compliance there. So I wonder if any other questions are coming in. Let me just check. Can't see any others right now. I'll give it a moment or two. And it's quite cool, once these questions do come in, you can, if someone posts a question that you already thought, oh, that's a good one, you can give it the thumbs up and it sort of jumps to the top of the list. That's what we found in the previous webinars. Well, it looks like we might be calling this one early. Well, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Oh, here we go. We've got one coming in. What is the seismic design standard that Australia uses? And do they use Eurocode as we use it in New Zealand? Also, is there both C1 and C2 rating in Australia? Oh, great Pat question there. So the seismic design standard is that Australian 1170.4. And do they use Eurocode as we do in New Zealand? That's quite a big question, that. So I don't know I don't know how to get into that one in a high level of detail, but I know the Eurocode is used similar to, it is definitely mentioned. It sounds like this question is more related to maybe like concrete anchors. It mentions C1, C2 rating here. So C1 and C2 is definitely, is that terminology, or that that anchor idea is definitely used in Australia like it is in New Zealand. And that does link back to the various standards where the C1 and C2 came from. So if you want to hear some more about C1 and C2 rated anchors, have a look back at our webinar 3, which we covered C1 and C2 for New Zealand. But I do know that, or I remember saying that C1 and C2 are slightly different in Australia and New Zealand from when you take it up the compliance pathway. But they're definitely it's definitely something that if you mention it in Australia and New Zealand, installers would know of those terms. We've got another question here. Do insurances or councils require certificates? I think the answer to that is yes. So councils definitely require the certificates. So when we're talking about, like in Victoria, the Reg 126, or in Queensland the Form 15s, that is a council requirement to show compliance. Similar to the PS1s are a council, something that comes from council as a requirement. And insurances, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure if that is a requirement, an umbrella type requirement, that it's required for all types of commercial projects. But I would imagine those certificates would be used in some way for insurance purposes. That's a great question. All right. Well, yeah, the purpose of these webinars is to be fairly quick and sharp. So 21 minutes. I think we can call that there. But again, if anyone has any questions, please reach out to us via LinkedIn. And if there's anything I don't know, I will definitely pass it on to the team to be in touch. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to you joining us next time. Our webinar 5 is going to be related to racking and the updates to the recent racking standards. So stay tuned for that. So thank you and goodbye.